welcome to the second regulatory symposium of Steptoe and to the plenary session of the symposium. We call it plenary because last year when we did it in the physical setting, it was followed by breakout sessions. This year it's both plenary and the only one for today. It will be followed by more breakout sessions. I really apologize for the technical anomalies we're facing, an almost inevitable corollary of the difficult era we're in. And so you can hear my voice, hopefully, but you cannot see my face. I could see all of you distinguished panelists. I think you could see me about 20 minutes ago, and then it all went dark as far as my screen was concerned. So again, profuse apologies, and let us start. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our illustrious panel and then offer some introductory remarks. And meanwhile, perhaps we can improve the format so that I can become visible as well. And let me start by introducing former commissioner of the FCC and acting chair of the FCC, Mignon Clyburn. Hello, Mignon.
Hello. Good morning. It's great to be here.
Good morning. And I caught a glimpse of you in the preparatory session, but unfortunately it could not last. And I wanted to also welcome Commissioner Ross Benham from the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Welcome, Commissioner Benham.
Good morning, Pantelis. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here.
And again, I did catch a glimpse of you as well. And then I wanted to introduce Commissioner Glick of the FERC. Hello, Commissioner Glick.
Good morning, Pantelis. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being with us and for your precious time. And last but not least, we have Commissioner Patrick Fuchs from the SDB. I think the most recent confirmation among our panelists from 2019. And Commissioner Fuchs, yours is the only agency among our agencies represented on that panel that doesn't have a C in its acronym. It's the Surface Transportation Board, of course, but it more than makes up for this absence of a C by being the original C, a successor in interest of the first agency of this kind that was the predecessor to everyone else, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which really hails from the 19th century. So welcome, Commissioner Fuchs.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Great. And let me say a few words about the genesis of the subject of this program, carrots as opposed to sticks. So we thought that Washington often gets a bad PR, and regulation often gets a bad PR, a bad reputation, because we live in a society that generally does not like permission. So we hear about the internet being all about innovation without permission. We hear about people wanting to move fast and break things, and you assume that when they say they want to break things, they don't want to ask permission before breaking them. And then we hear about people preferring to ask for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. So in this surrounding culture, we sense when we talk to clients, when we talk to industry, some skepticism about, some perhaps aversion to becoming engaged with Washington regulatory agencies. And we believe that, of course, permission, giving authorizations, withholding them, conditioning them, is part of the job of a Washington regulator, but there's much more to it, and it's also about carrots. It's about incentives to do the right thing that may also be the profitable thing. And so we wanted to explore the extent to which the public interest that each of your agencies has a responsibility for serving can converge in certain instances, not in all instances perhaps, with the private interest of some of the regulated companies. So that's the first goal. The second goal was that we thought there is also a misperception we would like to dispel, that regulation is boring. It doesn't have the flash of New York. It doesn't have the glamour of Congress. And so we wanted to refute that. I've spoken with all of you. I know how engaged you all are. I know how intellectually stimulating the issues that we face are, and I know you're excited and passionate about them. So what better panel to refute the idea that regulation is not fun? And so that's our twin objective, to prove, to show that engagement with regulation and regulators in Washington, in the industries that you have jurisdiction over, can be beneficial and a win-win, and can also be a lot of fun. And so with that, I want to start by turning to you, Commissioner Clyburn, because it's now been 7 years, almost to the day, from a significant accomplishment that I think exemplifies this type of incentive that we're talking about. So 7 years ago, you were acting chair of the FCC, and your tenure was short, but it was packed with accomplishment. And in fact, I often think that if there were a metric in the captions to the pictures of past FCC chairman on the in the FCC building, and if that metric was achievements per minute of tenure, you would rank among the highest in that distinguished group. So you achieved many things. You took action for your the cause about which you're passionate, calling prison inmates and calls from them. But you also, and again, 7 years almost to the day, took a very important action and brokered a grand settlement on interoperability. And this was about an important question, which is, if I am an AT&T subscriber and want to move to another company, to Verizon, to T-Mobile, to Dish, as of last month, do I need a different phone because the frequencies don't talk to one another? You resolve that very important issue and allowed competition to flourish, and in a way that left no one aggrieved. So could you tell us about how you achieved that?
Well, again, I want to thank you for joining such an incredible panel, allowing me to join such an incredible panel this morning. It's so funny. I chuckle a lot when I hear about that reference, and to sound a little wonky here, what Pantelis is referencing, for those who don't know, back in 2008, a problem occurred. That there were some successful bidders in the auction that got authorized 2 years before, and they expected when they bidded, in this particular band, the lower 700 megahertz band, that there would be no issues. That just like other mobile wireless bands, they would be able to build and to operate. However, a standard setting process created two non-interoperable separate band classes, and it ended up stifling competition, particularly in rural areas. So you had dozens of rural providers and regional providers who came to the FCC, and in 2012, we thought we were going to have a resolution. It did not happen. But in 2013, as you mentioned, Pantelis, in May of 2013, Julius Janikowski left the commission, and we were waiting every 2 weeks. We thought Tom Wheeler was going to be there. But in that time, because this issue meant so much to me, being from a rural state, I called the parties together. Again, they've been fighting at this time about 5 years. So you had the big guys, particularly, I know we don't like to mention names, but AT&T was a big guy in the room, at the time, and dozens of other players who could not build. Their customers, if they left their area, could not roam. They did not have the ability to have the latest and greatest devices. And so they were losing customers. They, people wanted whatever the latest smartphone was, and they could not get it. So lo and behold, I called people in the room, a very square room on the 8th floor in the FCC, beautiful view. But I will say to you that the climate or the atmosphere was anything but. There were a lot of hard feelings in that room. But I passionately felt that the best way to get to a resolution when it came to this particular item was to talk it out. And talk it out, or some might say duke it out, a couple of times. I had to call time out a couple of times. We did. And within a matter of weeks, what took 5 years, to resolve was in place. And by the end of October of 2013, we had an interoperable solution that allowed, in an efficient and effective way, more choice, more quality of service for customers, the ability to hire people and build out infrastructure. Those customers did not know much of a difference between the devices that they had in a matter of a year and a half. They could travel all over the country without loss of service. And so what this did, in a way that short-circuited all of the usual paths, we did not file a decision or an order. We did not have to go to court. But we came up, sat in that room, duked it out a bit, as I mentioned, and came up with a solution that was relatively seamless. It was definitely quick, and everybody won. So that was just one of those cases where I knew, I could see on my end that the parties were not far apart. But 5+ years of fighting, they could not see how close they were. So again, we came up with a solution that was a win-win. And to this day, you have more of a choice in terms of your carrier, regardless of where you live. And some of those rural and regional providers that were band locked, not landlocked, they were band locked. They are able, and they are thriving today. Many of them are thriving today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mignon. And this action has indeed left a lasting legacy. And it's also good to know that square tables, or square rooms at least, work, because we hear a lot about round tables. So it's good to know that despite the shape,
we have a series of rectangular tables. So rectangles work too.
Okay, good, great. So let me turn now to you, Commissioner Fuchs, and ask you for examples of, I think that my video may be returning. So I will move to this video format now. So let me ask you, Commissioner Fuchs, about incentive regulation within the strictures of the STB. You and I had the conversation last week where we talked about the reasonable practices jurisdiction of the STB and whether it can be used in a way that incentivizes carriers to do the right things. Also, you have a background, of course, in rail car safety. You were instrumental in finalizing and making those rules. And so I know that the STB, of course, doesn't have direct jurisdiction over safety, but there may be some indirect beneficial effects. So can you give us some examples of how you can use your tools, for example, reasonable practices jurisdiction, to give the right incentives, to do the right thing, which is also perhaps the profit.
I appreciate it, and it's great to see you, Pantelis. So I'll say that the STB, I think, has 5 core tools: reasonable rates, reasonable practices, service, competition policies, and then exit and entry licensing, including mergers. I actually think the best example in this space is our approach to reasonable rates. The STB, through its various rate review mechanisms, allows rail carriers to differentially price. And what this allowance provides for is that it basically provides an incentive, or at least does not provide a disincentive, for rail carriers to chase traffic that may have a higher cost structure, but also may have a higher willingness to pay and price to that traffic. But also, because it doesn't set a basic, say, revenue to variable cost ratio for a particular service, it also allows them to chase more competitive business that might have a lower willingness to pay. And in all instances, by getting that additional traffic, where the high end or the low end, the carriers maximize the amount of traffic that can contribute to their joint and common costs. And I think that's one of the reasons why, since partial deregulation in 1980, you've really seen a resurgence of the rail industry. I think that if you were to look at any measure, real rate level has gone down. Accident and incident ratios, accidents and incidents per million train miles, have gone way down. And every measure of efficiency, say ton miles per employee or what have you, have gone way up. So I think you can say rates have gone down, safety is improved, and efficiency is improved. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that carriers have more freedom to price. And I think even before you can bring a rate case, a carrier, a petitioner has to show market dominance or the absence of effective competition. And so for competitive traffic, that provides additional freedom to pricing. That's not to say that the board doesn't play an extraordinarily important role in ensuring, where there's an absence of effective competition, that rates are reasonable. In fact, that is probably our number one priority right now, is to make sure that we are effective and efficient in fulfilling that role. But it's just to say that the overall regulatory structure has seen gains over the years for some of the reasons that you've alluded to, Pantelis. I'd also say, just very quickly, that our approach to construction being very favorable to additional connections that build more competition in the marketplace is generally shared widely at the board. We like to see additional competition via new options. And then I would say that how we approach preemption and merger authorities is really to encourage carriers to provide additional options and to chase traffic and provide the safest and most efficient routes. And I'm happy to elaborate on that later. You did mention safety regulation, and when I was working in the Senate as well as at OMB, I did have the privilege of working on some safety issues. And I will just say on that, one of the things in the rail car rule that you mentioned is the creation of a performance-based standard, which is, you can set design standards, minimum criteria that a rail car has to meet, and that may be the baseline, but also providing industry the option to innovate and to improve safety by hitting a performance level as opposed to a design standard. And I think that creates an incentive to innovation and ultimately advances the goals of that regulation. And so I was pleased to push for and advance various performance standards, working with, of course, the excellent experts at the agency to do so. I would just underscore that I think incentive-based regulation and avoiding disincentives is extraordinarily important in regulatory structure.
Great, and that brings to mind, Commissioner Fuchs, when I was a young associate working on some railroad matters, I was involved in some of the first steps towards the adoption of standalone cost. So it's a brilliant methodology for assessing what is the right rate to charge. It was developed by Baumol and Willig, Professor Willig, a very good friend of mine, brilliant economist who also combines the twin objectives that we talked about at the outset, being both brilliant and beneficial, as well as immensely entertaining and witty at the same time. And I think the appeal of the standalone cost method was that to many of us adults, it looked like a game. It was like building a railroad, building a train, because you have to build the optimally efficient train. But the serious idea behind it is to reward efficiency. So isn't that another form or one of the forms of incentive regulation where you encourage the railroad to be efficient? And do you think it has worked?
It's a great question, and that's exactly what I mean when I say that the board's rate review mechanisms allow for carriers to differentially price. I think that when you look at how a standalone cost proceeds, you look at the underlying cost structure of the optimally efficient railroad, and you look to see what kind of capital contributions are necessary to sustain that optimally efficient railroad in the long run, on basically on a replacement cost basis. And so that's what I mean when standalone cost testing, some of the board's other review methodologies allows carriers to differentially price, and then allows, again, like I said, to trace traffic at the top end and the bottom end. The one thing I will caution, however, when it comes to standalone cost is, as you describe, you have to build a hypothetical railroad on paper, of course. And what we see is these cases can take years, $5 to $10 million in litigation, thousands and thousands of pages. I had staff count work papers, exhibits, et cetera, and I cut them off at 100,000 pages. And so I think that it's extraordinarily important to have a rate review methodology that allows for differential pricing and that allows those incentives that you described. And I think standalone cost is designed for that. So I totally agree with you on the premise. I will say, though, that we have to continue to think about whether or not that particular rate review methodology is the best one for smaller cases, smaller businesses that may not have the resources to fully mount such a case. And it's a very tough issue because you don't want to design an alternative methodology that sacrifices those incentives and that ultimately jeopardizes or impacts carriers' ability to earn revenues to maintain their network. So it's a difficult dilemma. It's one of the biggest dilemmas facing the board right now. But I agree with your overall premise that it's absolutely essential rate review methodologies allow carriers to differentially price and to be as efficient as possible.
Yes, thank you very much, Commissioner Fuchs. Commissioner Benham, if I could turn to you and say that you have been in the news for all the right reasons. The newspaper of record, printing all the news that's fit to print, thought it fit to print an accolade about you and your contributions are as chairman of the climate market risk subcommittee of the market risk committee that came out. I think it was yesterday, right? This is a blockbuster document and was justly praised by the New York Times. And reading about it reminded me of a case that Steptoe had in the 80s, plus I had joined, I think, where we were asked by one of those barrier islands, the developers of one of the barrier islands off South Carolina's coast, to help them because they couldn't get flood insurance. And one can only shudder and imagine this problem magnified perhaps a million times. So could you tell us what among the tools that the CFTC and perhaps other regulators have to mitigate those problems can be done in a way that incentivizes as opposed to requiring or prohibiting?
Thanks, Pantelis. And again, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. And I think it's important often when I have discussions like this in person or via webcam, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the CFTC itself. I'm sure many of your audience knows who we are, but for those who may not, we are a financial markets regulator. We're one of two in the U.S., in addition to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is popularly known, obviously, for the regulator of stock exchanges and equities. But we at the CFTC oversee derivatives, which are futures, swaps, and options contracts on futures. We're a very old agency. We historically were within a division or a sub-agency of the Department of Agriculture, because historically futures contracts, the underlying commodity was agricultural products, but that over the past few decades has changed significantly, where the large percentage of the products we as the CFTC oversee are financial in nature, anything from currencies to interest rates to indices on financial markets. So broad remit, very important agency that really focuses on risk management and price discovery. So anything from corporate interest rate risk management to financial institution currency management to, again, a farmer and rancher are trying to hedge risk for major commodity crops. I'm one of the 5 commissioners, as you pointed out, and what you alluded to was a report that released yesterday by an advisory committee. Many agencies have advisory committees. These are great tools for policymakers and regulators to really engage with stakeholders and market participants to see what issues may be existing in the marketplace and what we as policymakers and regulators need to do to address ongoing or potentially future risk. As the sponsor or the sort of head of the Market Risk Advisory Committee about 1.5 years ago, and months even before that, I had started thinking about the intersection of climate change and financial market risk. Often I think when people think about climate change, they naturally think about the environment, they naturally think about energy production, which are obviously key and important elements of a changing climate. But there are so many other sort of knock-on effects from, national security to human health. And then as we're seeing, and not climate change, obviously, with the pandemic, but we saw how these extreme moments that we have to deal with affect financial markets and the economy. And, there's a lot of literature about climate change and how it may affect the economy. And I decided to convene a subcommittee of broad stakeholders, a pretty diverse coalition, anything from financial institutions to institutional investors, academics, agricultural participants, energy participants, public interest, to really have a long debate and discussion and produce a policy report about climate change and financial market risk. And naturally, you can think, and this is something I've thought about for a number of years, as I mentioned, but we think about what's going on in the West Coast right now with our fellow Americans in California and Oregon and Washington and other places, Colorado as well. And, I'm sure a lot of you have seen photos from the West Coast and these very really apocalyptic photos of daytime and, being dark or red sky. And these are, in fact, I think products over time of a changing climate and things we need to address. What does it mean for, migration of people? What does it mean for asset values, commercial or residential? What does it mean for human health and how people will interact with each other? So ultimately, I put this committee together and we're hoping to put together a really comprehensive report that would assess how financial regulators can build a more resilient system and then, interact. And this is kind of to your question, create incentives so that market participants build more resilient institutions so that as the climate continues to change, we can better address it and avoid large-scale risk that would affect the economy, would affect job growth, and ultimately affect local and regional communities across the country. So the report came out really well, and it's early days, obviously, but a lot of thorough and very exhaustive recommendations that I'll certainly go through, and I know I'm going to do my best to sort of amplify and raise awareness among the regulatory community in the U.S. and overseas. But again, it's a process. It's step one here, and I think we need to continue to have the conversation and the dialogue and work together. Climate change is obviously viewed very frequently in a partisan nature, but I again try to make this clear that I don't view this as a red state or blue state thing. The climate is changing in many states across the country, and we're seeing record floods or hurricane season, or obviously wildfires, as I mentioned. And I think these are things that it's important for us to invest in sort of infrastructure, not literally, but sort of metaphorically invest in the country now, so that we can sort of reap the gains and the returns on that investment in the future by mitigating and lessening risk. And certainly a huge part of this is the private sector. And that's something I'm very proud of, that the recommendations and the policy came from a broad coalition of market participants. And a lot of the recommendations are driven by the private market. A lot of the action has been done thus far by the private market, and will continue to get done by the private market as they see these risks affecting their bottom lines and then affecting their institutions writ large and where they exist in different communities across the country. But there's definitely, in my view, a role for the government and in policymakers to work with the private sector, to work with communities so that we can establish flexible but thoughtful sort of rules of the road and incentives so that we can work towards a stronger, more resilient economy as we face this changing climate environment. So very proud of the effort. A lot of thanks and gratitude to the individuals who were a part of it. It was a big committee, 34 members, diverse, like I said, but it was unanimously supported, this report, 34-0. So I think that sends a pretty strong message to folks here in DC, but also across the country and the globe, that there's a serious conversation happening, and hopefully this will snowball and grow over the months to come so that we can implement helpful policy to help mitigate this risk.
Yeah, congratulations, Commissioner. And this strikes a very interesting parallel with what Commissioner Clyburn was describing. So this is a process of summoning all the stakeholders in a room around the table, be it square or round, and in both cases, getting to consensus. And that makes me think that, there are some statutory tools to facilitate regulatory negotiation. There's the Regulatory Negotiation Act, perhaps the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and those have gotten somewhat of a bad name. And I've participated in some of those exercises where instead of arriving at consensus, what we would arrive at would be a report that had annexes of dissenting views and no consensus, and there were disputes about the annexes, whether the annexes will be called annexes or attachments or appendices. So obviously, it's not always an ideal process, but perhaps another look should be taken at those tools available at agencies' disposal. And to turn to you, Commissioner Glick, last but not least, you similarly were the author of a very impressive piece about climate change and the FERC that featured in the published in the Energy Law Journal last year. And where I think that the thesis, as I read it, is that by and large, the agency has tools already to help with climate change. You identified two areas. One is, of course, the jurisdiction over wholesale transmission of electricity, where you have the authority to remove barriers to competition, thus perhaps encouraging the generation of more environment-friendly forms of energy. And the other, of course, area is permitting, infrastructure permitting, where I understand that in many cases it's a yes or no, but also there may be approval subject to conditions, etc. So can you describe how this edifice of things, or this arsenal of tools that the FERC already has, can be used in a way that motivates as opposed to prescribes, prohibits?
So, thanks. I think that's a very interesting point. When I first came to FERC back in November of 2017, I had a pretty good sense for what our statutory authorities were, but I'd always assumed, well, we don't really have much authority to do much on the issue of climate change. That's more of an area for EPA, for instance, related to energy sector greenhouse gas emissions. But it became apparent pretty early on in my tenure there that we were getting a visit from a number of people, and the subject of climate change kept on coming up over and over again with regard to the proceedings that were pending before FERC. And as you mentioned, I thought, this is a very interesting subject. We should really think about it some more. So one of my legal advisors, Matt Christensen, and I sat down and put together a pretty thoroughly researched law review article, and Matt deserves most of the credit for that. Really, and with the catchy title of FERC and climate change. But what we did is we explored everything that we do at FERC and how that impacts climate and what role the Commission has, so to speak, in terms of trying to lead towards a reduced greenhouse gas emissions environment. And you mentioned removing barriers. And that's one thing that we're statutorily required to ensure that there's no discrimination. And it turned out over the last 10 years or so, the Commission has had a number of proceedings examining rules that were put into place probably 10, 15, 20 years ago, regional market rules related to electric generators and electric transmission. And in many cases, those rules were written when some of the newer technologies, wind power, solar power, energy storage, and so on, where those technologies weren't really at the forefront of people's minds. Those technologies weren't necessarily feasible or cost-effective at that point. And so a lot of the rules that were written for these energy markets turn out to have a discriminatory effect in some ways on some of these technologies that are, in some cases, different. Energy storage is a good example. It just operates differently because you can only charge the battery for a certain number of hours before you have to then send the energy to the grid from the storage facility. And so FERC has, over the last, again, decade or so, issued a number of rules, proposed rules, and finalized rules, encouraging or at least requiring the regional market operators to essentially eliminate these barriers one by one. First, it was on intermittent generation, which is wind and solar primarily. And then we had a rulemaking on storage, and we still have a pending rulemaking with regard to a distributed energy resource. You have your solar panels on rooftops and so on. And so I think a lot of those technologies have evolved over time, and I think getting rid of some of those barriers certainly will lead to more clean generation and, of course, reduce emissions. But in addition to that, FERC has, over the last 20 or 30 years, promoted more of a competitive electric generation markets for the most part, where in the past it was pretty much just the regulatory system was you utility builds a generating plant. The utility recovers the cost of that plant plus a reasonable rate of return, and everything was litigated out at FERC. Now, for the most part, most of these markets are a competitive environment, and we try to make sure that the barriers to competition are eliminated. And what that does is obviously it leads to a lot more different generators, different types of generation, consumer preferences, which consumers are definitely much more interested in clean energy than they used to be. So those preferences are represented in the choices they're allowed to make in certain states and certain regions and so on. And so I think by creating a competitive electric environment, what we've done is we've opened up the door, so to speak, to these cleaner technologies, again, wind, solar, and energy storage, and that are becoming much more cost competitive, and they're winning out. And we're seeing that fossil fuel generation is on the decline, and zero emissions generation is on the upswing at this point. But you also mentioned another area of authority that we have with regard to natural gas pipelines. The Commission is required to consider applications to build. We essentially are the siting agency for interstate natural gas pipelines throughout the country. And our statutory requirement is essentially to find that these pipelines are in the public interest. And when we consider a public interest, when we make a public interest determination, we essentially weigh the benefits of a project, the economic benefits, the ability to get natural gas from one place to the next, and so on, against the potential adverse impacts, the environmental impacts, whether it be on wetlands or species or air quality or something like that. And we essentially weigh them, and if we find the benefits outweigh the costs, we're supposed to approve the project. But the Commission has used its authority in terms of approving these projects to essentially require or impose conditions to require mitigation of these adverse environmental impacts. So, for instance, if a project is going to take too many wetlands, we require a project developer to do something to at least create, help protect wetlands elsewhere, or in its construction process, make sure that the wetlands aren't too adversely impacted. We do that with every particular environmental impact except for one, which is climate change. We've had quite a debate within the Commission, among the commissioners, as to whether we should consider the impact of these pipeline projects on climate change and what we should do about it. But what I've been advocating for is that if we can mitigate for adverse impact to species, or we can mitigate for adverse impact to wetlands, for instance, why can't we do the same thing for climate change? So, for instance, if a pipeline developer is going to build a project or an LNG facility, for instance, it's going to lead to a significant amount of additional greenhouse gas emissions. I think that developer could certainly offset those emissions in a variety of different ways. It could buy RECs, it could plant trees, it could do a whole bunch of other things. And I think so. The Commission does have Commission's authority with regard to conditioning pipeline approvals as well. I think that thing could have a significant impact on the U.S. Policies related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. What you mentioned about the condition of requiring protection of wetlands elsewhere in connection with a particular project, I think tees up my next round of questions to all of you, which is about mergers and conditions to mergers, and more broadly, the agency's condition authority. People like mergers. I think the reason may be that they view them a little bit like marriages, except in the corporate realm, and except that for a marriage, you don't really need much of an approval. For mergers in regulated industries, you do need approval by the agency regulating the sector, sometimes also by the antitrust agencies, sometimes not, as in the case of the Surface Transportation Board. And so I would like to ask a little bit about the authority of the agency in connection with mergers and how good behavior, good acts can be incentivized. And let me start with you, Commissioner Fuchs. You have the somewhat dubious distinction our agency has of having gone through the longest merger proceeding, I feel safe in saying, not only in the history of this nation, but of humankind. When the Great Northern Railways tried to merge with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, that was James Hill, that was in 1901. The merger was finally approved in 1970. That's a merger negotiation taking all of 68 years. And one wonders that the lawyers that were with it sitting at the start, some of them may have followed it through its conclusion, but it resulted, of course, in the creation of a great railroad in 1970, Burlington Northern Santa Fe. And I understand that this has changed. I don't think Congress allows the STB to take 68 years to approve a merger. There's actually a deadline, perhaps 70 days. And I've seen a decision saying that it's only an exhortation. But be that as it may, the STB is perhaps the only agency that pursues the Department of Justice review of competitive effects from railroads. And you have some tools at your disposal that the DOJ may not have necessarily. The DOJ might look at the vested source to ameliorate competitive effects, have the authority to impose conditions that are short of division, such as trackage rights conditions. You allow a third carrier to use part of the line of the merging railroad. And so, can you tell us a little bit about this, about whether those kinds of conditions have worked, about whether you can eliminate increased concentration effects over the
It's a great question. As you rightly point out, the STB does have exclusive jurisdiction over exit and entry licensing, including mergers. We have 4 different classifications of different combinations. You can be major, you can be significant, minor, or exempt. The most weighty of those types of transactions is major, which is between 2 Class 1 railroads. We have not seen a formal application for that in about 20 years since the board issued new merger rules coincidentally, it held a merger moratorium when a major merger was proposed about 20 years ago, and that ended up taking more time and ultimately not happening. So for major mergers, what the board standard is basically enhancement of competition. The way that those merger rules interpreted the public interest standard more broadly was that any merger between two Class 1 railroads, basically had to enhance competition. And so, that is, to circle back to your first question on incentive-based regulation, that of course creates an incentive for carriers to be thinking about those types of enhancements. And even in the case of other types of transactions, there generally, is a view towards likely and substantial anti-competitive effects, and the benefits outweighing those effects, and as the board's thinking of approving and conditioning the merger. On your point on conditions generally, you're quite right that trackage rights are among the type of conditions that the board may impose, and I think this starts to speak to why the board has exclusive jurisdiction, which is, given our understanding of the rail network and expertise in that area, we can craft some of those competitive conditions, say on trackage rights or reciprocal switching, et cetera, through routes that may alleviate any competitive harm, or carriers can propose those types of conditions in order to meet the standards of the board that I outlined. And to this day, we have cases basically enforcing some of those conditions in previous major mergers to ensure that shippers have competitive options that would have otherwise been removed by the combination of firms. So you're right. Our jurisdiction is exclusive, and a very large part of our review is assessing the competitive harm and seeing what kinds of conditions we can impose to alleviate that harm if it meets our standards. And this is really in the agency's wheelhouse as being the freight rail regulator. Department of Justice, of course, plays a role in providing views on major mergers and the like. And but it is our job ensuring that there is adequate competition in the marketplace and using the tools at our disposal to ensure that.
Pentelis, Pentelis,
yes.
One of the things that the behind the scenes that people may not know or take for granted is there is a sort of a regulatory mix when it comes to review, particularly at agencies like the FCC when it comes to big mergers. Take some of the more recent ones. Again, you have to get the green light from the Department of Justice, at the FCC, and in some cases, depending on the states, at the state levels. And so, it makes for sometimes an expensive, complicated, series of hurdles that companies, especially ones who want to merge, have to go through or have to experience. But from a public interest standpoint, I believe the more eyes, the better. Because one of the reasons, one of the things that I think we don't often admit, if I put my regulatory hat back on, is there is such a thing as regulatory lag. We are, my prime directive when I was at the FCC was, Title I, Section 1 of the Communications Act. That was very clear about competition, public interest, public safety, and having ubiquitous advanced telecommunications services that would be affordable for those. But in it and how you get that in quick order, especially with children going back to school and so many of them not being connected, how do we get there in a way and in a time frame that the public expects? And so when we talk about regulatory tools and other tools at our disposals, including carrot, we need, we're forced to, I think, by the very nature of those agencies to have all of those tools in our boxes and keep that in mind for the public interest.
Yes, thank you very much, Mignon. And let me try to meld what you said with what Commissioner Fuchs said. First of all, you mentioned the regulatory lag, which of course is always a consideration. I wanted to assure those of our clients who may shudder at the thought of a merger proceeding that may take 68 years that in that case, actually what was happening is that the two railroads were operating out of the same headquarters in St. Paul, but there was a wall dividing them. So all that the final approval meant was that they could demolish that wall. So it was not as bad as that. But both you, Mignon, and you, Patrick, mentioned the need to, I think, not only preserve competition, but further promote it. And that raises some delicate questions about what is an appropriate condition and what may be beyond the realm of appropriateness. So we hear often it's said that mergers are not Christmas trees where you can attach any gift whatsoever. And there is a body of precedent that says, look, a condition is appropriate when it redresses a competitive problem. And so how do you deal with that conundrum? Do you believe, and by the way, to throw that in the mix as well, there was a decision in the DC Circuit 2 weeks ago regarding the Charter Time Warner Cable merger, where a think tank had, because of course the merger participants have no interest in attacking the conditions to their deal, because without them there would be no deal. But there can be a think tank attacking them and saying, no, I mean, there shouldn't be an obligation to provide broadband to certain communities, etc. And the court expressed skepticism. It was one Trump appointee, one Reagan appointee in the majority of the panel expressed skepticism about the ability of the commission to impose conditions. So long story short, Commissioner Clyburn, what would you do? Would you want to satisfy yourself that the condition that says provide broadband to kids flows from an effect of the merger? In other words, without the merger, things would have gotten worse, and you want to fix that? Or is it appropriate to go further and say, look, if you give us a voluntary commitment that you will do even better than you're doing today, that will help? What are you
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm sounding a little flippant, but yes. One of the things I thought about during the conversation when you talk about the laws that enable agencies like the FCC to enforce and implement some of the objectives that are part of the Prime Directive that I mentioned earlier. When you look at the tools that are increasingly needed for us to stay safe, to communicate, for again, in your example, for children to be connected affordably. What are the seeds that you plant or can plant, which would include conditions in this instance, in this example? What can you make more attractive and come to, hopefully a conclusion that a number of parties agree with that will further enable? It shouldn't be static. One of the things that, it is a challenge for a regulator when you have those conditions that are codified at a point and place in time. Acts, laws, and decisions are points and places in time based on the information that you have at that time. But what are the types of things that you can do to ensure more dexterity, that the interpretation is broad or nimble, the ability to interpret is nimble enough for you to achieve even more goals? That is always, for me, in the back of my mind, that any decision you have is future-proof. And so, that's why I said yes to both, because it's not just what the lens that I'm looking through, or I was looking through then as a regulator. What types of doors of opportunities would be more open and available going forward as the application and the technologies change and our needs evolve. So yes to all of the above. If you're a good regulator, you're thinking in a multifocal lens when it comes to that.
Pantelis, if I can speak to the kind of the board's role in conditioning and sharpen kind of what I said a bit earlier. I think that to echo Minion, I think that when it comes to major mergers, we have to be, under the board's rules, it has to have an eye towards the enhancement of competition. I think the reason why the board issued those rules is because, the rail network is such that a major merger would have, incredible consequences. It would, a lot of the mergers that have been contemplated effectively form transcontinental railroad. And, there are important considerations when it comes to lost geographic competition and lost product competition. I would just differentiate, and so I think that is why those are the board adopted those particularly stringent rules, because of the magnitude of that type of combination at this point in time, given the structure of the rail network. It's worth, though, distinguishing those major mergers from other types of mergers, other types of combinations. As I mentioned, there are 3 other categories. And so, for example, if you take a minor transaction that is one, that involves, say, a non-class 1 railroad, what the statute says is that, the board shall approve that type of transaction unless it can do 2 things. 1 is find likely and substantial competitive harm, and 2 are anti-competitive effects, and 2, that it finds that those anti-competitive effects outweigh the public benefits. So that at least suggests that if the board can't make an affirmative finding that the anti-competitive effects outweigh the public benefits, the substantial and likely competitive effects outweigh the public benefits, then it ought to approve, and it calls into question what type of conditioning authority the board might have. I think that the potential reasoning behind this view of the statute is that, when it comes to a minor transaction, those transactions might be particularly ill-suited to bear the weight of a government intervention that is attempting to perfect the deal, but is not ultimately targeting a deal that makes society worse off. This is, society would be worse off if the anti-competitive effects outweigh the public benefits. So I would just note that I think that the board statute, at least, only speaking for the board, differentiates between the review standard and the, and implications for conditioning between different types of mergers, particularly the, differentiating the major mergers, which I think the board has taken a more assertive posture.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Hughes. And I'm back on the phone. I apologize again. I think we'll have to have a conversation with our vendor about incentive regulation and whether it can be incentivized in fixing those issues, or else I think the solution of government fiat instead may be an inevitable one. So I apologize. I'm back on, though. And I wanted to ask you, Commissioner Glick, the FERC also has jurisdiction like that of the FCC to evaluate mergers of regulated entities. It has parallel jurisdiction with that of the antitrust agencies, but it has the authority to impose conditions. And the one question that we've been dancing around in this part is whether the conditions jurisdiction of the agency allows it or not to sweep past the jurisdiction that it otherwise would have. So now you want something from us. You want the permission to do an important merger with important synergies, perhaps in the billions of dollars. And so is that an opportunity to get some concessions that otherwise would not be enough tools to extract, or not?
Oh, so we do have jurisdiction over electric utility mergers, and we essentially share that jurisdiction. You mentioned the other agencies like the Justice Department and the FTC and the U.S. government, but also with the state governments and the state regulators. And you see, when they review these mergers, you see they impose a whole slew of conditions that are maybe more expansive than the areas we look at. For instance, they impose sometimes rate freezes for a number of years, or an agreement that the company will invest a certain amount of money in the local economy for a number of years, or that they will retain jobs even after the merger in such and such state. Our review at FERC, although we have a public interest standard that could be considered broad, at least over the last 1 or 2 decades, is really focused primarily on the impact on competition and competitive markets. And as I mentioned earlier, we've tried to encourage competition in wholesale electric generation. And so what we tend to look at is, again, the impact of both merger on the competitive markets and so on. And sometimes what we do, if we feel that there's going to be an adverse impact on competition, is we essentially say, after the merger, Company X, you won't be able to charge market-based rates anymore. You're going to have to charge rates based on your cost plus a rate of return, which presumably, at least in certain number of hours of the day, you're going to be making less than you would otherwise if you could charge market-based rates. And so we also encourage utilities to take certain actions regarding their transmission facilities as well. But we primarily, again, link our merger authority with competition, although I think you could read the laws as giving us further authority to go beyond that, but we've been reluctant to do so over the last couple of decades.
Great. And that's also a good example, the condition that you mentioned. And I hang up my phone because I'm now back on video. The token is working again. Because that's the kind of thing that the Justice Department or the FTC not very well impose. They're interested in more structural remedies, but this is the kind of thing that the sector agency can do, where the antitrust agencies fear to tread, and it may often reap very good results for competition. I wanted to turn to one last area, and I realize, Katie, that we are passing on the questions time, but perhaps we can take another 5 minutes and then take a compressed amount of questions in perhaps 10 or 15 minutes. And that area is to deal not so much. Oh, before I do that, let me get back to you, Commissioner Benham, and ask you. The CFTC, of course, I think does not have jurisdiction to review mergers per se, but there are conditions, for example, that the CFTC can impose on registrants. And is that a similar tool to elicit desirable behavior?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And you're right, Pantelis, we don't have jurisdiction over sort of M&A activity, but we do have core principles which dictate ensuring that markets are fair and efficient, but also not manipulated. So in essence, we do have derivatives markets are very interesting in the way they work and function. And, unlike an equity exchange where you can have a stock trading on multiple exchanges, derivatives futures contracts tend to be very siloed on one exchange. It's all about really open interest of the contract. So you tend to have success in different contracts on single exchanges. So we do have sort of anti-manipulation authority within our enforcement toolbox, but as a larger a point, we ensure that there's no fraud. And I mean, again, markets are fair and efficient and operating smoothly. The one thing that I would say in terms of incentives and the conversation that's been going on thus far, which probably better relates to what we do, is through enforcement. And this has been something that, I know market-based regulators have done. Justice Department certainly does, is just like sort of cooperation agreements. And the regulator's engagement with a defendant or a bad actor, and being able to either move the case along as in an expedited fashion, but also getting as much and as the best information possible throughout the enforcement action to sort of get to an end result. And we have a policy at the CFTC under the current leadership to engage with cooperation agreements, and in the back end of it is that the market participant will, typically not be fined or penalized as much as they typically would be under a number of sort of penalty structures that we have. And I've been a little bit of a cautious supporter of that methodology. It was something that before the current chairman, it was an initiative that was laid out by our enforcement division. And I think there have been certainly success cases where we're, essentially trying to work and incentivize, and less the stick and more the carrot with the stakeholder and the market participant, that, if you do in fact identify wrongdoing within your institution, know an individual or a group of individuals who's violated the law, or recognize something sort of ex post that you did it before, if you bring it to us, we certainly would be appreciative of that, that sort of acknowledgement of the violation, and sort of return a little bit of a lesser fine in return. And we think that creates a better environment, a better ecosystem for the market. So that really is important, to have engagement, dialogue, and really just transparency between the regulator and the stakeholder. My caution, I would say, and this played out recently in an enforcement case that's on our website, is, we had an infraction by a market participant, and in the first sort of go round, they weren't completely transparent with all the facts and circumstances of the violation. We subsequently found out that there wasn't a full disclosure of the facts and the circumstances of the violation, and subsequently they were, hit with a larger fine after we did find out the full scope of issues and facts. So I think there's a balance to this, especially from a financial markets regulator. We want to engage, we want to have dialogue, we want to incentivize a culture of fairness, transparency, and so acting within the rules and the law. But we shouldn't, in my view, be too lenient or too flexible, because I think history has proven that folks will take advantage of that. So whether it's a harder stick on the back end to sort of really push folks that if you're going to come to us and request some sort of leniency, then you need to be fully transparent. And if you're not, then you will, there will be consequences. So we'll see. The policy is obviously ongoing. It's something that I know from a criminal perspective, it's decades old and has worked in terms of, developing cases. And I think we're, for the most part, doing a good job of implementing it within the CFTC, but again, a bit cautious, and I hope we can continue to tweak and refine it so that it's better, more effective, and that we don't have slips in the future. We have to keep folks accountable.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. That really anticipated my last area of questioning, which has to do with enforcement. And this is less of a carrot and more of a shorter stick. How long do you want the stick to be, and are there beneficial consequences to stepping forward and with candor, self-report? Of course, there is a danger of lack of candor when somebody steps forward and self-reports less than is out there, as you said. But I think all the agencies do have somewhat similar programs, whether formalized or more informal, where cutting and nipping an enforcement problem in the bud may get you some, not kudos, but perhaps more lenient treatment. Is that a useful tool in your view? What do you think, Commissioner Clapper?
Not only is it but it syncs up with realities. And I guess now I'm telling all of the family business now what is going on at all of our agencies is we've got personnel challenges. And so the reality is some of the detailed analysis that we expected to be doing ongoing, we physically, literally cannot do. And so that doesn't mean that this is a regulatory free zone. It is a recognition that if we don't see or sense it, or if there are not complaints, and things are turning in the direction in which is beneficial for the consumer, enabling competition and giving the variety and the products and services that we need and desire, then yes, you're going to continue to see that type of some people would call it more leniency, but a sort of the new reality or the emerging reality of not as much of a spotlight, but a watchful eye on agencies to ensure that they are doing what they say, and that they're conducting themselves in a manner that is expected.
Great. Commissioner Fuchs, do you have thoughts on such a program?
Thanks, Vandellas. I think, following Minion's remarks, just in general, I think that, the STB is particularly dependent on hearing from stakeholders that may be affected. We don't have field offices, we don't have inspectors and the like. So we are particularly dependent on a complaint-based approach, but we also maintain a real customer and public assistance program to allow people to come to us on an informal basis. We have contacts with every railroad to work out issues through informal dialogue before the need to bring a case or to elevate to the level of enforcement action. So I would just kind of emphasize that it's extraordinarily important for the board to present a posture of openness and accessibility, particularly on an informal basis, to allow us to really enforce our statute and to work out problems.
Great. Commissioner Glick, is that something that you consider a valuable tool, particularly in negotiating settlements as part of the enforcement responsibilities of the Commission?
Yes, no, it is a very valuable tool, and I assume as other agencies probably do, we have a set of penalty guidelines and how egregious the action is and a whole bunch of other factors that go into it. But we certainly, we do allow for reducing the penalty, so to speak, if the company has a robust compliance program, self-reporting a violation, and also cooperating with the investigations. My concern is, over the last couple of years, FERC hasn't been as aggressive as it had been in the past on our enforcement program. And because of that, I think companies might not find it as valuable to self-report or cooperate. They don't think they're going to get slapped on the wrist or not going to get anything more than a slap on the wrist. And so I think it's important to have those carrots to incent companies to act right. But if you don't wield the stick every so often, I don't think the companies are going to try to take advantage of those carrots either.
I apologize. So do we have time for one question, Farrell?
Yes, I'll push it to the slide area now.
All right. Could you actually read it to us? That may be more efficient.
Certainly. This question is directed to Board Member Fuchs. You dissented from disapproval of a line sale in New York State, with the other two board members objecting to a permanent condition that you are putting the deal seamlessly up for MOE. Various efforts have been made to seek reconsideration of that decision. Is there anything you can say about the timing or substance about that proceeding?
I appreciate it. It's a good question, and I think I see from my Q&A box that it came from Mike McBride, who I will hasten to note is a fellow Wisconsin Badger. So good to hear from you, Mike. So I will. I will just say, listen, that case is currently pending. As you point out, there was a reconsideration petition that was filed in June. And so on the overall timing, being cognizant of the pending proceeding and not saying too much, I will say that when, it's been about, 90 days and the board tries to act expeditiously. So typically we try and process reconsideration petitions as quickly as possible. And so I leave you with that in projecting the timing. Without getting into the merits of the case, I'll step back and say generally, this is exactly what I'm talking about on minor transactions, something that, let's say, outside of this case, but let's say that there is a case where there's an end-to-end, transaction. I think it's important in that instance for the board to evaluate the pre-existing circumstances. What was the competitive environment before the transaction? And then evaluating the competitive environment after the transaction. And, there can be a temptation to look at the post-transaction, ignore the pre-transaction competitive situation, look at the post-transaction and try to perfect that and to try and make it better. And occasionally you may see with a minor transaction that potentially has benefits that outweigh its costs, that if you try and make the benefits greater, or try and address some aspect of the cost, that minor transaction might not be able to withstand the weight of that intervention, and you may actually delay or destroy the benefits of the entirety of the transaction when you consider it as a whole. So I just think that in general, the board, when it comes to minor transactions, which, again, if I could as stringently as possible differentiate from major transactions, when it comes to minor transactions, the board, and I think the statute clearly states that the board should be considering whether or not the competitive harm is substantial and likely, and importantly, whether or not that competitive harm is outweighed by the benefits, because we really don't want to delay or destroy benefits, trying to make something a bit better, even though society is better off from it. So that is the general approach that I am thinking about when it comes to minor transactions, and it's an approach that I try and apply consistently across cases.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And let me first, I'll start by extending an intermittent thanks to our vendor for this event, who allowed us intermittent video access. And there may have to be a gentle conversation with them. And the incentive involved may well be the incentive of possible non-payment. But I apologize to everyone for the technical obstacles we had to overcome. But seriously, I really wanted to extend my profuse thanks to all of you. This was a fantastic conversation. You achieved both the objectives that I set out in the beginning. You showed how regulation can be beneficial, can be an area where public and private interests converge, and how it can be fun as well. And so I'm predicting that this event will result perhaps in a rush of industry to your offices, people knocking on your doors, on the doors of your schedulers, for more engagement with all of these agencies. So thank you very much. And you also gave us food for thought and for discussion in our subsequent 3 events that we will hold on mergers, on infrastructure, and on the question of whether elections matter for it. So again, thank you, Commissioner Clyburn, Commissioner Benham, Commissioner Glick, Commissioner Fuchs. Thank you very much for being with us. And thanks everyone for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.